everyone. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you so much for all your support. We have a lot of what appear to be Jehovah's Witnesses in the audience today. Yes, in fact, I recognize this brother here. You look like the Bethel elder from my Don't Let the Jehovah's Witnesses Coerce You into Baptism show. Is that right?
Yes, it's me!
Oh. And I see you've got your hand up. You must have a question. What can we do for you?
Why don't Jehovah's Witnesses accept blood transfusions? Myth. Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in medicine.
Great, thank you.
Or
Thank you very
medical
much for your
treatment.
question.
Fact. We seek the best possible medical care
okay.
for ourselves and our
Thank
families.
you. Yes, you know what?
When
That's
we
an
have
excellent
health
question.
problems,
Thank you very
we
much.
go to doctors
In
who
fact,
have
it's such a
skill
good
in
question.
providing
I think we
medical
should
and
spend a few
surgical
moments
care without-
talking about this topic today. When I was growing up in the 1970s, in fact, it was a very hot topic. It was not uncommon to go from door to door and face people that were beyond livid about this topic. You know, they'd say things like, you allow your children to die, get off my property, you murderers, drop dead, beat it, scum, comments like that. Sorry, it's just conjuring up all kinds of memories from my past. But, you know, so a person really needs to examine their beliefs on this topic and determine how they feel about it and be confident about it. Because, you know, when I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, they really hammered home this idea about blood transfusions and how dangerous they are. And for a few years, even after I left the organization, I carried around with me my blood card because I was a bit nervous. But once I started doing a bit more research into it, I began to realize that I had nothing to fear, and I feel pretty confident about where I stand. But it's important for everyone to feel confident for themselves, and that's why I think we should talk about it today. But let's just get up on the screen an example of what the blood card was, so you can see, in case you don't already know. So here's an example of what the blood card was. It's a legal signed and witnessed document that can speak for you if you were ever unconscious. Plus, it absolves medical staff of being sued should you die in their care. All JWs carry them in their wallets. Following religions blindly, though, and assuming that they want what's best for you and have your best interests at heart, have led to the deaths of many people, though. For example, we have up on the screen here the Heaven's Gate people, and oh, how do we get Stephen Lett's picture up there? Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so we have the Heaven's Gate people, and we can see here that 39 people died following that group. I also call them the Hale-Bopp people because they were expecting to live behind a comet or something. Then we can see that 76 people died following David Koresh and his group of people in Waco, Texas. Then we have an even worse tragedy that happened where 909 people died following Jim Jones, the People's Temple, I believe they were called, in Guyana. And then we see that it's been estimated that 50,000 people have died by refusing blood transfusions. I know that's a massive number. The other cults that we looked at don't even come close to that number. But I'm going to put a link in the description to show you how that number was arrived at. So to be fair, we really don't know how many of those Jehovah's Witnesses would have lived even if they had had a blood transfusion. Or maybe by avoiding the blood transfusion, perhaps they avoided getting some other type of illness. We really don't know. And that's why it's so important that you do your own research and that you feel confident with whatever stand you choose to take. And that's why I'm glad we're doing this show today so we can talk about it. So for somebody who really wants to study the Bible and be a Bible student, you're going to want to know, well, what does the Bible really say about the medical use of blood? If a doctor, for example, tells you that you will die without having a blood transfusion, does the Bible command that you refuse it and die? And Jehovah's Witnesses claim that they don't store blood and that blood must be poured out. Is this true? And what the are blood fractions? Oh, sorry, I forgot I had my profanity prohibitor on. So in answer to the first question, using blood for medical reasons is not actually mentioned in the Bible, but the Bible does talk about blood. And Jehovah's Witnesses have some scriptures that they would show you about this topic. Let's just have a look at them and see what they would use to show you. So from the JW.org website, they would first show you Genesis chapter 9, verse 4, where God tells Noah that only flesh with its soul, its blood, you must not eat. Then we've got Leviticus 17 verse 14, where God said you must not eat the blood of any sort of flesh, because the soul of every sort of flesh is its blood. Anyone eating it will be cut off. And then they show you Acts 15 verse 20, where we're told to abstain from blood. As already stated, the medical use of blood is never mentioned in the Bible. In fact, the only time blood is forbidden in the Bible is in regards to eating blood, as brought out in this watchtower here. We see from this watchtower here, it says, each time the prohibition of blood is mentioned in the scriptures, it is in connection with taking it as food. And so it is as a nutrient that we are concerned with it being forbidden. It's funny that they called it a nutrient there. Once they realized that blood wasn't a nutrient to your body, their stand on that changed. Their stand on blood never changed, but their reasons changed, which is very interesting. We know too that a blood transfusion is not the same as eating blood, as the organization had once taught. It says that a cardiovascular surgeon said, a blood transfusion is an organ transplant. That's from the October 22nd, 1990 Awake magazine. And then from the How Can Blood Save Your Life brochure from 1990, it says yet a transfusion is a tissue transplant. And then the question is asked from the ajwrb.com website. Consider a man who was told by his doctor that he must abstain from meat. Would he be obedient if he quit eating meat but accepted a kidney transplant? One of the scriptures that we read from the jw.org website said that we must abstain from blood. So we need to ask ourselves, well, what does abstaining from blood mean? Well, let's see what it says at 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 11 says, Beloved, I urge you as foreigners and temporary residents to keep abstaining from fleshly desires, which wage war against you. So does abstaining from fleshly desires mean that we must abstain from eating, drinking, and sleeping? No, of course not. Obviously, it's all relative. And as we learned from that previous watchtower, when the Bible talked about abstaining from blood, it was talking about abstaining from eating blood. So do we have any biblical examples of anybody who ate blood? We do. Were these ones who ate the blood struck by lightning, or were they stricken with leprosy or some other hideous, disfiguring illness? Well, let's have a look. I believe it's at 1 Samuel chapter 14. King Saul had made an oath to God during a battle that his men would not eat until the enemy was defeated. So we see from 1 Samuel chapter 14, starting in verse 31, on that day they kept striking down the Philistines from something to something, and the people became very tired. So the people began rushing greedily at the spoil, and they took sheep and cattle and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and they ate the meat along with the blood. So it was reported to Saul, Look, the people are sinning against Jehovah by eating meat with the blood. At this he said, You have acted faithlessly. Roll a large stone to me immediately. Saul then said, Spread out among the people and say to them, Each of you must bring his bull and his sheep, and slaughter them here and then eat them. Do not sin against Jehovah by eating meat with the blood. So each of them brought his bull with him that night and slaughtered it there. And Saul built an altar to Jehovah. This was the first altar he built to Jehovah. So were these men in danger of dying? No, they were famished due to that bad oath King Saul had made. So they greedily rushed at the spoil, it said. They broke God's law on eating blood, even though their lives were not on the line. Yet God did not kill them. It's an important example to remember. We also have the example of Jesus. We're looking at Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 to 14. It says, After departing from that place, he went into their synagogue, and look, there was a man with a withered hand. So they asked him, this is the Pharisees, Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. He said to them, If you have one sheep, and that sheep falls into a pit on the Sabbath, is there a man among you who will not grab hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do a fine thing on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored sound like the other hand. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him to kill him. We see from the parallel account there in Luke chapter 6, verses 6 to 11, I like the way the question is worded there, where Jesus said, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or to destroy it? We see that Jesus broke God's law to heal a man. He demonstrated the rabbinic principle that the obligation to save life supersedes Jewish law. Life is precious to God, so if the life of an animal or the well-being of a human was at stake, he showed that it was more important to save a life than to obey the law. Big lesson here. And note the reaction of the Pharisees. They would rather apply the letter of the law and watch an innocent person or animal die or suffer. Sound familiar? So if a doctor tells you that your life is in jeopardy, we must keep this principle that Jesus showed in mind. The Bible shows us that life is very sacred to God. In Bible times, when blood was poured out after an animal died, it was out of respect for the life that was taken. So life was lost, and out of respect for that life that was lost, the blood was then poured out. With a blood transfusion, no lives are lost. The person donates the blood, and then they continue to live. The only life that is lost is when the JW organization pushes one of its members to refuse a blood transfusion, and then that person dies as a result. A person who willingly gives up his life is not showing respect for life. When I look again at this Awake magazine cover, I feel so sad knowing that most of these kids would have been alive today if they'd known the truth on God's viewpoint of blood. They would have been just a few years younger than me, enjoying life with their loved ones. According to the organization, in the late 1990s, and due to religious complications in Bulgaria, I won't get into it, but I will provide a link in the video description below for you to research it further, and it's pretty fascinating. So just a few years after this Awake magazine, the organization changed the rules on what punishment they would give a member if he or she had a blood transfusion. Check out the Secret Elders Handbook, Shepherd the Flock of God. Under the subheading, Willingly and Unrepentantly Taking Blood, it says if someone willingly takes blood, perhaps because of being under extreme pressure, the committee should obtain the facts and determine the individual's attitude. If he is repentant, the committee would provide spiritual assistance. But notice further down where I highlighted it, it says, on the other hand, if the elders on the committee determine that he is unrepentant, they should announce his disassociation. So you may or may not be disfellowshipped after you have a blood transfusion, depending upon how sincere or maybe how much you cry in front of your judicial committee. It would not be wise, though, to walk around the Kingdom Hall after having a blood transfusion and say, hey, I had a blood transfusion and I'm alive today. You know, walking around promoting it. Not smart. But, regardless of that, the Bible never uses this as a reason to shun a brother. And, the organization wasn't always so judgmental when it came to blood transfusions, as we see from this 1958 Watchtower. So from this Questions from Readers, it says congregations have never been instructed to disfellowship those who voluntarily take blood transfusions or approve them. We let the judgment of such violators of God's law concerning the sacredness of blood remain with Jehovah, the supreme judge. An individual is not disfellowshipped because of having voluntarily taken a blood transfusion or having approved of a dear one's accepting a blood transfusion. It is not for you or anyone to act as the judge. I keep seeing in JW publications, even today, that they say that we must pour out blood, that it cannot be stored. But is this true? Must we do this? Well, Jehovah's Witnesses say that we do, but they apply it very inconsistently. And when you start to research it, it's very weird. First, we'll look at the October 15th, 2000 Watchtower. It's a question from readers where the person was asking about medical procedures using one's own blood. It's saying that the obligation to keep the Mosaic law ended when the Messiah died. Yet God's view of the sacredness of blood remains, they say. And if you flip over the page, it says, the Mosaic law is not enforced now. Nevertheless, Jehovah's Witnesses respect the principles God included in it, and they are determined to abstain from blood. And then if you see these other references here, we've got the February 1st, 1989 Watchtower, where again, someone's asking the question about when the law covenant ended and when was it replaced by the new covenant. We see the scripture there, Colossians 2:13 and 14. It says, God kindly forgave us all our trespasses and blotted out the handwritten document against us, which consisted of decrees and which was in opposition to us. And he has taken it out of the way by nailing it to the torture stake. And again, further on, it says he poured out his Holy Spirit, and this showed that God had canceled the law covenant, figuratively nailing it to the stake on which Jesus had died. But if you notice the 1964 Watchtower reference below that, the April 1st Watchtower, it says, "But many persons in Christendom are also bound by traditions that Christ in no way obligated them to keep. Some religions, for instance, still require the observance of the Jewish weekly Sabbath, yet at no time did Christ indicate that this law was to continue to apply to his followers, since Christians are no longer bound by the law." So, do you see why I find the whole thing really weird? I mean, we looked at various articles there. They all showed that we're not under the Mosaic Law covenant anymore. We read that scripture in Colossians where it said the same thing, that it was nailed to the torture stake. And then the article from that one Watchtower went on to talk about how, well, some members of Christendom, they still try to do things like the Sabbath, you know, and they're showing that that's wrong because it all ended. When the law covenant ended, we don't have to obey the Sabbath laws anymore. So I find the whole thing really weird because it's like they're saying that we are still under the principles, though, of pouring out blood. You know, they say, like, what about Leviticus? What about Deuteronomy? Well, you know, we're not under the principles of the Sabbath. We're not under the principles of tithing. We're not under the principles of stoning people today, thank God. So why would we be under the principles of whether or not we cannot store blood and that we have to pour it out? I don't know. I don't get it. But since Jehovah's Witnesses still feel that we are under the principles of not being able to store blood and that it must be poured out, well, I guess we have to wonder, though, well, what about blood tests? So somebody had a question in the questions from readers at the June 15th, 1978 Watchtower. They're saying, would it be wrong to submit to a blood test? The answer given is based on their knowledge of the scriptures. Most of Jehovah's Witnesses, if not all, do not object to such tests. The small quantity of blood removed from the body is not eaten or injected into someone else. It is merely examined or tested before being disposed of. You may know, too, that vaccines cultivated in stored blood are also acceptable by the organization, but I guess their reasoning on this is that it's just a small quantity of blood. "Oh, sorry, officer, but I only just have a small bag of crack that I merely want to sell." I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? So a small quantity of stored blood is okay, but any more than a small quantity is a sin. So I guess the question is, well, how much is a small quantity before I get disfellowshipped, Brother Pharisee? But, you know, if you can believe it, this bizarre line of reasoning gets even worse when it comes to blood fractions. When you think about that Awake magazine cover again, you know, you wonder how many of those kids on the cover would be alive today if they were allowed to accept blood fractions. I mean, we'll never really know. But it's interesting to see how Jehovah kept flip-flopping on whether or not we could accept blood fractions. Let's take a look. So first we're looking at an Awake magazine from 1954 where they said blood serums are wrong. That it's being made of whole blood places it in the same category as blood transfusions as far as Jehovah's prohibition of taking blood into the system is concerned. But then in 1958 they did a reversal and they said that blood serums are okay. It says the use of blood fractions to create such antibodies is not the same as taking blood, either by mouth or by transfusion, as a nutrient to build up the body's vital forces. But then in 1961, they said that blood serums are wrong. The Bible is very clear that blood could properly be used only on the altar, otherwise it was to be poured out on the ground. The infusing of some blood fraction to sustain one's life is wrong. But then in 1964, blood serums are okay. We leave it up to the conscience of the individual to determine whether to submit to inoculation with a serum containing blood fractions. He is not directly eating blood, which is expressly forbidden in God's word. Here the Christian must make his own decision based on conscience. That they said again, it's a personal decision. And then again in the 1965 Awake magazine, that serums are prepared from blood. However, they do not involve the use of blood as a food to nourish the body, which the Bible directly forbids. So it's up to the person's conscience. And then we see what they felt about hemophilia treatments. They did a bit of flipping with that too. In 1975, they said it was wrong to accept this factor 7 and factor 9 treatments. They said clotting factors derived from blood are not abstaining from the command from blood. Sorry. And then in 1978, Then they did a reversal and said, no, actually it's okay. We've taken the position that this question must be resolved by each individual on a personal basis. Christians individually must decide what to do. A witness is not allowed, and they would never donate blood, but they may gladly accept blood fractions from worldly people. Oh, I'm not bringing anything to the potluck luncheon, but I'll gladly eat what everybody else is bringing. I mean, that's kind of poopy, hey? So their conscience won't allow them to bring it, but they will gladly accept them. Well, I thought there was more happiness in giving than there is in receiving. Not so if you're a JW after somebody's worldly blood fractions. Very weird. But do you have any idea just how much blood has to be donated for just one injection of gamma globulin, which is a now acceptable blood serum that Jehovah's Witnesses can take? Let's find out. From this Awake magazine, it says here, we are told that it takes 1 1/3 pints of whole blood to get enough of the blood protein or fraction known as gamma globulin for one injection. So the blood is donated and pooled for these blood fractions. But any idea how many donors were used? In the Immune Deficiency Foundation, or IDF Patient and Family Handbook, you'll see what it says. See, it says there, it's prepared from the plasma collected from a large number of normal individuals, usually between 10,000 and 50,000. So a lot of blood needs to be donated to make up blood fractions, and from up to 50,000 different donors. And that's all okay by the organization. Their stand on blood is so very odd, confusing, and inconsistent. But at least I guess they allow some things up to your conscience. In fact, there was an important Kingdom Ministry insert from 2006 that had much information on blood fractions, including worksheets for witnesses to review to help them decide what fractions and treatments their individual consciences would allow them to have. So looking at the Kingdom Ministry insert here, it says that Jehovah's Witnesses do not accept transfusions of whole blood. Blood fractions are elements from blood that are extracted through a process called fractionation. Are fractions also covered by the command to abstain from blood? We cannot say. Oh, I think you can. Many fractions are derived from blood that has been donated for medical purposes. See, I took the same slide and I added a picture of Moses there and asked the question, if blood must be poured on the ground, why aren't blood fractions poured out? Then it continues, if some of my blood, so these are some of the questions that people can ask themselves. Like if my blood is diverted through various machines and not poured out, is that okay? Am I okay with that? Does my conscience say that's not a bad thing? What about dialysis or heart-lung machines? And then of course we've got the sheets here that people can go through, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. But when you look over this worksheet of all the different blood fractions the organization says may be okay, how can this honestly be considered as abstaining from blood? Imagine Moses looking at these worksheets. Blood was not divided up that way in the Bible. If the organization says that the medical use of blood is wrong, then you cannot pick and choose which blood fractions or products you will abstain from any more than you can engage in a little fornication or a little idol worship. And then if you look at this last slide here showing the acceptable blood fractions as a percentage of total blood volume, we can see here that as we know, according to the Jehovah's Witness doctrine, whole blood is not allowed. And if you divide that up into the 4 major blood fractions the way they divide it up, you can't have that either. But if you divide it up further, then you can. And yet it still equals 100% of the blood. It's all blood. Just because it's a portion of blood, it doesn't change it from as if it's something different now. It doesn't make any sense. And then I love the bottom here. This is from the jwfacts.com website. He says that the 4 major components used is an arbitrary measure. Some medical books list just 2 major components, red blood cells and plasma. If the Watchtower chose the definition of 2 major components, it could then allow white blood cells and platelets. Other sources list 16 major components. If chosen, this would then disallow several fractions now allowed. Other sources divide blood by chemical composition, which would totally change again what is allowed. The Watchtower Society has used an arbitrary definition, resulting in an arbitrary result. and that the only way to have a coherent doctrine is to have an all or nothing policy. Wow, we covered much information there, and I learned a lot from my research. Why don't we just do a quick review of everything that we learned today? Here we have some points to remember. Each time the prohibition of blood is mentioned in the Scriptures, it is in connection with taking it as food. The Bible never mentions avoiding blood in medical situations. We're no longer under the old law covenant, so we don't need to pour out blood anymore. And abstaining from blood in Acts was referring to abstaining from eating blood. Both an Awake magazine and a blood brochure compared blood transfusions to organ or tissue transplants and are therefore not food. According to 1 Samuel chapter 14, King Saul's men were not killed by God for breaking God's law when they ate blood. Jesus demonstrated that it was more important to save a life than to obey the law. He was disgusted by the Pharisees, who would watch an innocent person die while obeying the letter of the law. Blood was poured out during animal sacrifices in the Old Testament to show respect for the life lost. No lives are lost with blood transfusions. The blood donor gives and carries on. The organization flip-flopped a few times on whether they would allow their members the freedom to accept blood fractions without being disfellowshipped. The organization overrides the old law covenant command to have blood poured out and not stored when it comes to blood tests and blood fractions because it's just small amounts. It takes 1 1/3 pints of whole blood for 1 gamma globulin injection, and plasma is collected from between 10,000 and 50,000 people and then pooled for blood fractions. That's a lot of stored blood that is not being poured out. The alleged 4 main blood components is just arbitrary, as other medical books claim there are only 2, making white blood cells and platelets okay. So the topic of the medical use of blood is a topic that JWs and all ex-JWs really do need to research. Why? Well, because we've seen that tens of thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses have lost their lives because they've put their trust in an organization who has the stand that they do against blood and blood transfusions. You know, Jesus said that he wants mercy and not sacrifice. And yet the Jehovah's Witness organization doesn't seem keen to change their stand on blood, and they don't offer mercy to their members. So please research this topic for yourself and make sure that you feel comfortable with how you feel. And don't let any organization push you into taking any stand against something that you don't feel comfortable with. So thank you very much for watching my video. And if you liked it, like it. And we'll see you again next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.